Christians are losing everything they already had in Gaza. The Christians that have nothing to do with Hamas, Christians that have nothing to do with terrorism, had nothing to do with October 7th, are losing the property they built with their own hands is now complete rock.
Ruslan.
Police arrive at UCLA after violent clashes break out amid dueling demonstrations, classes canceled. These are happening everywhere. Columbia, which has been crazy. I actually have some friends that went out to those. This is happening in UCLA. There was allegedly a Jewish girl that was attacked. Allegedly, that some of the police response to this are a bit aggressive. This is happening, I believe, in Michigan. This is happening everywhere. These protests are happening everywhere. And it has a lot of people asking questions about the geopolitical state of the world, okay? And here is the reality. Multiple things can be true at the same time. Okay, multiple things can be true at the same time. These protests of clashing between pro-Palestinian and pro-Israeli demonstrators are causing an upheaval of epic proportions in terms of what's happening. Here's what can be true at the same time. And I know this is complicated because people want a binary one or the other. Here's something that is true that is uncomfortable. It is true that the IDF isn't always as careful as the international community would like them to be. Okay. That is true, to the point where they've had to apologize for, unfortunately, deleting 3 of their own hostages. The hostages that were taken by Hamas, the IDF accidentally deleted 3 of them while they were waving white flags. At the same time, the IDF is under incredible pressure. They've been false flag situations before. So it is true that, man, the situation there is a mess. At the same time, it can also be true that Israel has a right to defend itself and prevent future attacks. That can also be true at the same time. So multiple things can be true. Israel could have a right to defend itself after October 7th and prevent any future attacks by Hamas. And yet, in the way that they defend themselves, can be sloppy at times. The day all this stuff had it, Christians were freaking out because I said Israel could be heavy-handed in their responses. And in them responding, they could be heavy-handed, which will then cause more clashes. That is, like, all of these things could be true at the same time.
Yep.
People should be able to be unapologetically Jewish without having physical harm against them, and be unapologetically pro-Israel without having harm against them, while at the same time, them not endorsing every single act that the IDF does.
Yeah.
Right? Nobody is endorsing the potential flippant deletion of civilians. I don't know if maybe people on the far right that are like Palestinians or Amalek or whatever the nonsense that's being pushed in the far right of Israel. Maybe there's a percentage of those people, but most people generally, most Israelis, most people, they're not trying to wipe out all Palestinians.
Yeah.
Right? And I would say not all Palestinians are trying to wipe out Israel and believe Israel doesn't have a right to exist. All of these things could be true at the same time. Israel can have a right to defend itself, but also, man, when do we go from defense and prevention of future attacks to vengeance, right? Disproportionate amount of vengeance. And they could potentially be taking things in the best of their abilities in this guerrilla style warfare. By guerrilla, I just mean like the terrain is crazy. They could potentially be doing what they can to try to mitigate like all of these things could be true at the same time.
Yeah.
But here's what I do find interesting. A couple things, okay? And I was just talking to my man, Adam Sosnick, about this. We had this conversation. So the first thing that we have to acknowledge is that this is not just something that's happening in flesh and blood. This is not a geopolitical issue, right?
Yeah.
This is not just a geopolitical issue. That we are not fighting against flesh and blood enemies, but against evil rulers and authorities of the unseen world, against mighty powers in this dark world, and against evil spirits in the heavenly places. Now, I'm not saying this as all Palestinians and Palestinian supporters are bad, and everyone who's pro-Israel is good, and Israel has a blank check to do whatever they want. I'm not saying that, because both of them are without Christ, and both of them have a different virtue ethic that they're navigating, and an eye for an eye makes sense in their paradigm. We talked about that already. Both of these folks are operating in what makes logical sense to them. Now, I have a heart for Israel, but I also have a heart for my Palestinian friends. I've been to Israel. I don't have a problem with Israel existing, but we also have to acknowledge that a lot of these pro-Palestinian protesters aren't just pro-Palestinian. They're teetering pro-Hamas.
Yeah.
They're teetering genocidal language. And again, folks over there would say, well, man, I mean, look at how many civilians have passed. Right? If they got a 1-to-1 ratio, even if they got a 1-to-1 ratio, which they say they do, meaning one civilian for one militant,
Yep.
that's still 15,000 civilians. A lot of those are women and children. That's kind of crazy, right? And I don't think anyone's free speech should be limited. I don't think people should not be allowed to say that, be critical of Israel. And at the same time, I don't think people should be allowed to not be critical of Muslims and radical Islam.
Yeah.
Right? And so I was reading this, and this is what I sent to my man Adam Sosnick from Valuetainment. We were just having this conversation, and this is going to upset some of you guys. The crazy part about this is, as I'm going through Genesis with my son, okay? As I'm going through Genesis with my son, you know, all of this stuff is in a way prophesied in Genesis.
Wow.
So check this out. This is going to shock some of you guys. And I'm not trying to simplify this conflict. I'm not trying to do that. But if you go back and you read the story of Ishmael and Isaac, you guys know Abraham had the promise Abraham's wife tried to take the promise of this child. They were old. God said, I'm going to make your descendants as numerous as the stars. They tried to take that promise into their own hands, and they had Ishmael with Hagar. Okay. Ishmael, this was the prophecy towards Ishmael. You're now pregnant and will give birth to a son. This is Genesis chapter 16. You give birth to a son. You are to name him Ishmael, which means God hears. For the Lord has heard your cry of distress. This son of yours will be a wild man, as untamed as a wild donkey. He will raise his fist against everyone, and everyone will be against him. Yes, he will live in open hostility against all his relatives. That is the prophecy of Ishmael. Later, Abraham has Isaac. Isaac is the promised seed, the promised son, who the nation of Israel comes through, okay? You want to know something really interesting?
Hit me.
Jews and Christians view Isaac as the promised child. Muslims view Ishmael as the promised child. That's crazy.
Yeah, that's wild.
All of this would be a super oversimplification if Muslims themselves did not say, we identify Ishmael as the promised child. And in their identification of Ishmael as the promised child, which some believe is where the Arab people and the Muslim people came out of, it says right here that he will live in open hostility against all his relatives.
Yeah.
And what do we see? We see constant hostility, right? Now, some people say, Ruslan, that's an oversimplification. That's Islamophobic, yada, yada, yada. This is a faith that was spread by the sword. This is a faith that is hostile towards people that aren't in the faith with their jizr attacks. And this is a faith that has also been sinned against at times by the West. Again, multiple things can be true at the same time.
Yep.
By the West and by Israel. So, but all of this is a spiritual manifestation of in the geopolitical sense, right? It's all that. And so when you have Muslims saying, no, Ishmael was the guy, which, by the way, I don't even know if Palestinians may have more overlap with Israeli DNA than with Arab DNA, because Arabs don't really view them as Arabs, right? That's a whole separate conversation, and I've had this conversation with Palestinians. When they're saying that, then it just gives us pause to think, well, maybe this is something spiritual that was prophesied thousands of years ago, and Christians and Jews, which, by the way, we do not have the same view of just war theory. It's closer, are looking at Isaac and saying, yeah, Isaac's the promised Messiah, which then the land of the 12 tribes of Israel, because it was Abraham got the promise, then there was Isaac, and then Israel came generations later. So even the promise of God didn't come instantly. It was multi-generations later before the 12 tribes came. And so that's my thought on this. And so what we're seeing is just a physical manifestation of this today in the conflict all over. And it's going to continue, by the way. It's going to continue. So my hope and prayer would be that Israel would clean this up as quickly and as cleanly as possible, because it's not a good look for them. And not because I think Iran is going to bomb them and start a world war. It's just, it sucks when people are being hurt. You guys understand that there are Christians in Gaza. There's Christians in Gaza right now. And I'm not talking about just Orthodox Coptic Christians or Syrian Christians. I'm talking about there's evangelicals in Gaza. There's an evangelical church, a Baptist church in Gaza that is now an IDF military base, because they took it over. Sheesh. The roof gave in. This is crazy. And people are losing everything they've already had. Christians are losing everything they already had in Gaza. The Christians that have nothing to do with Hamas, Christians that have nothing to do with terrorism, had nothing to do with October 7th, are losing the property they built with their own hands, is now complete rubble.
Bummer.
That sucks.
Yeah.
That sucks. So this is a very complicated situation. But if you have the folks that are, identifying as Ishmael, and it seems like a lot of this stuff is riled up over and over, it's just a different paradigm. And I think what we need to remember is that the militant nature of this, which I believe is demonic, they know how the West thinks, but they don't think like the West. And that is, we're seeing the manifestation of that and playing into that in terms of these protests that are turning violent across UCLA and across these different folks getting hurt. And it's sad. And I have friends that are Muslim. I have friends that are Palestinian. I have friends that are Muslim. We have these conversations. They're very, very, very tense, but it is what it is. So according to the Bible, that prayer is extremely important in terms of us being transformed from the inside out when we get aligned with God's will. For the Christians watching this channel, I want you guys to implement these spiritual disciplines in your day-to-day life. And the only way I've been able to do this consistently is through writing down my prayers in a prayer journal that does a few things. One, it allows me to reflect and come to God humbly and ask Him to move on my behalf. And two, it allows me to document my prayers, which ultimately help me remember the very things that I was praying for and see the hand of God tangibly in my life when He answers them. So I would urge you, consider writing down your prayers. It could be in a blank notebook. It could even be on your phone. Or you could check out the one I personally designed and used from my own quiet time and spiritual discipline that I think will be a huge blessing. It's the exact structure and system that I've used for years to pray and be more consistent in my spiritual disciplines. You can pick yours up today by clicking the link in the pinned comment below. All right, I'll see you over there. Peace.